All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hey everyone, super glad that you guys can make it tonight and tonight's talk on the central event of the entire Christian faith, which of course is the resurrection and what Easter celebrates. So before we begin, I wanted to introduce our group and our speakers tonight. The group hosting our talk tonight is called Klesis, and we're a Christian fellowship on the UC Berkeley campus. And my name is Nathan. I'm one of the alumni mentors for Klesis. And given our nation's current situation, we're moving all of our stuff online. We thought it would be a great opportunity to share discussions on a Christian perspective. So every single Wednesday night at 8 p.m., we're going to have our Klesis Weekly, where we're going to discuss a new topic, and everybody is welcome. Next week, I'll be actually the one speaking, and we're going to be talking about moral objectivity or questions of right and wrong. So make sure to join for that. But tonight's topic is really near and dear to my heart personally, because this was actually one of the central arguments that convinced me to become a Christian as a former atheist. And I'm really not exaggerating when I say that it blew my mind. So tonight, exploring whether or not Jesus actually did resurrect is Sean Malong, who is a current senior at UC Berkeley studying cognitive science, and Godwin Long, one of our alumni mentors, who is a software engineer at Salesforce by day and a Christian apologist mentor and master's student by night. So before we begin, I want to ask everyone, please mute your mics for the duration of the talk. And also for the best viewing experience, for viewing pleasure, I would recommend putting Zoom into the speaker view by clicking the view options in the screen sharing bar and selecting view side by side. This way you'll be able to see the slides and the speaker right next to each other. So without further ado, let's go ahead and kick it off to Godwin and Sean.
Well, thank you. Thanks for that intro, Nathan. Everybody hear me? Okay. All right. Yeah. So again, my name is Godwin, as Nathan introduced, and over there, Sean. So we know that listening to us through this digital medium could feel somewhat impersonal. So we just want to start off by sharing our stories to hopefully allow you guys to know us a bit. So first, here's a picture of me and my friends who serve at Klesis Christian Fellowship together. And right there in the middle is me. So actually long before this picture was taken, I was born and raised some 7,000 miles from here in the city of Hong Kong. My parents were both Christians who took me to church every week. But church for me was always just that place I'd go to on Sunday, but never really got more personal beyond that. And in middle school, I started having some doubts about whether all of this God business was even real. And when I couldn't find the answers I looked for, I just thought, why bother? Why even call myself a Christian? So I ended up walking away from everything in high school. And as it happened, when I attended UC Berkeley in 2012, I got plugged back into a Christian fellowship. And for the first time, I was shown some pretty compelling reasons to believe in this religion that I once doubted. And just to make a long story short, I did some reading on my own, and eventually I became won over by the Christian claim, and I just saw it as something worth giving my whole life to. So now, 8 years later, as Nathan said, I'm a coder by day and a college mentor by night. And so that's me, and now I'm going to hand things over to Sean to let him introduce himself.
Hi everyone, my name is Sean, and for me, I was born and raised in Northern California. I grew up as a Buddhist, but in 4th grade, my best friends brought me out to church for the first time. And from then on, I slowly learned more and more what Christianity was all about. In high school, I faithfully attended youth group on Wednesdays and Sunday service every week, but it was not until I came into college where I was able to join a Christian fellowship and started to actively ask questions and search for evidence behind the Christian faith. I started to realize that Christianity is not only about faith and feelings, but there are evidence and reasonings that can support and strengthen the Christian faith as well. Now, as a senior studying cognitive science, I am a student by day and still a student by night, but I get to regularly and joyfully share Christianity with the people that I know.
Yeah, so as you can see, Sean and I had very different starting points. He was brought up in a Buddhist family and I was brought up in a Christian one, but our lives converged on this one point, the truth claims of Christianity. We were both captivated by this 2,000-year-old religion, and we've seen our lives completely transformed as we got drawn in. So hopefully over the course of this talk, we'll get to share some of those reasons with you guys. But anyway, now that we have all the formalities out of the way, let's move on to the topic of the night. So again, the question in front of us tonight is this: did Jesus resurrect? But first off, why even this question? Of all the many miracle claims in the Bible, why did we pick the resurrection? Well, the Bible actually tells us why. 1 Corinthians 15:17 says, if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is useless and you are still guilty of your sins. Well, what this says is that all of Christianity hinges on this one claim, that Jesus was raised from the dead. You don't have resurrection, you don't have Christianity. So if you ever find yourself on a quest to disprove Christianity, look no further. Here is where you start, and you can quote the Bible on this one. And second reason is what a famous atheist once said. The evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstandingly different in quality and quantity. So the late Anthony Flew was one of the most celebrated atheists of the 20th century, just like the Richard Dawkins of our day. I think it's pretty notable that even as an atheist, he had such a high regard for the arguments for the resurrection. So hopefully that was enough to convince you that both Christians and non-Christians agree that the resurrection is a good starting point, when we want to look into Christianity. So now let's actually talk about the resurrection, or the Easter story.
All right, thank you for that. But yeah, whether you're joining this talk as a believer, atheist, or agnostic tonight, even if you've never set foot into a church before, you've probably heard of the Easter story. Not the one involving bunnies and eggs, but the Easter story. The one about God who became a man called Jesus, who spent 3 years preaching and teaching, who was killed on a cross and miraculously came back to life in 3 days. Whenever the story about a dying and rising God comes up, a common reaction is to scoff and say, wait, you actually expect me to believe that a dead person came back to life? Psh, give me a break. Last time I checked, dead people stayed dead. And I mean, who would blame him? If someone ran or maybe Zoom bombed your Chem 1A lecture today and yelled, guys, you're not gonna believe who I just saw. Abraham Lincoln, bro, he's alive. I saw him with my own eyes. Okay, maybe it's not that hard to imagine this happening at Berkeley today, but let's say this was your friend, someone you knew personally. I think you would have good reasons to question his sanity and even reevaluate your friendship. Yeah, so why is it any different with Jesus? How come when it comes to Jesus of Nazareth, Christians expect us to take them seriously when they say that he rose from the dead? Could there actually be sound evidence that Jesus came back to life? Well, this is exactly what we hope to cover tonight.
Okay, so here's a rundown of what the talk is going to look like tonight. So first, we're going to start with talking about methods. How do we go about examining a claim like the resurrection? After that, we're going to be introduced to two scholars, Gary Habermas and Mike Licona, who are considered experts in the subject. And then we're going to look at what these two scholars have found, starting with a list of 6 historical facts that a lot of other scholars agree on. And once those facts are established, we're going to look at the different theories that have been used to try to make sense of those facts. And lastly, we're going to talk about the significance, why we should even care about the resurrection. So to start us off, Sean is going to talk about methods.
Yeah, so we said that our goal tonight is to build a case for resurrection. Well, how do we do that? Well, this is how we would not do it. One thing we won't do when it comes to the resurrection is to study it scientifically. And why? Well, it's because science is the study of natural phenomena through repeated and reproducible trials. We can drop apples from trees over and over and over again and observe that it accelerates at 9.8 meters per second squared. That's what we know about gravity. But so why can't we do that for the resurrection? Well, it's because the resurrection is a historical claim. It is a claim of a one-off event that happened in history in first century Jerusalem. So you can't reproduce a historical event in a lab or study it under a microscope, like how science can't tell us whether Alexander Hamilton died from a duel with Aaron Burr. Historical events need to be studied with a historical lens. When it comes to studying the resurrection, we need to apply historical methods to study it and reason about it like a historian.
Now, speaking of historians, let me introduce you to two of them, Gary Habermas and Mike Licona. So these are two of the world's leading experts on the subject. So while studying the resurrection, Gary Habermas scoured over 3,500 sources in multiple languages, most of which are actually written by skeptics or non-believers. And the panel that reviewed Gary Habermas's dissertation at Michigan State included atheists and agnostics alike. And that's because he wanted to make sure that his methods were as objective as possible. Now, Mike Licona, he was no slacker himself. He called himself a second guesser by nature. And for him, it didn't really matter what others said about the resurrection. He had to know for himself the truth, even if it meant giving up his Christian faith. So as he was preparing for his 100,000 word dissertation on the resurrection, he intentionally set up debates with other scholars who had opposing views in order to check his own methodologies to make sure that he is not biased. So as you can see, both Habermas and Lacona were very committed to following the truth wherever it led. And I think very few people who have studied their works thoroughly can accuse them of being biased.
Yeah, so what are the facts that they came up with? First, here is a complete list of 12 historical facts that Gary Habermas gathered. But for tonight, we won't have time to cover all 12, so we're just going to look at 6 of them. We're going to include a link to this image as well in the chat so you can follow along with us. Nice. Now, I want to mention something right away. Habermas and Lacona picked these facts because they have majority consensus among all scholars. Yes, even the atheists, skeptics, and agnostics. During a famous debate between Gary Habermas and Antony Flew, the atheist we referred to earlier, Antony Flew, these facts were the starting point to their debate, which meant that even an atheist like Antony Flew acknowledged these as historical facts. But obviously, he disagreed on the conclusions drawn from the facts. So now let's go through the facts one by one, and we'll briefly comment on some of them.
Okay, so fact 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. There's actually a wealth of evidence that Jesus was a real historical figure who died by crucifixion in the hands of Romans. And this is not just Christians talking. Non-Christian historians like Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, and Pliny the Younger have all mentioned Jesus in their writings.
Fact number 2, Jesus' tomb was found to be empty just a few days later. And how do we know this? There are actually records of early Christian opponents accusing the disciples of stealing the body. Now, we're going to look at this claim in more depth later on, but notice what these accusations tell us. They tell us that the tomb of Jesus had to be empty because otherwise there would be no body for the disciples to steal in the first place.
In fact 3, the disciples had experiences they actually believed to be literal appearances of Jesus. Now, notice what I'm not saying here. I'm not saying that the disciples actually saw the risen Jesus because that would be arguing in circles. I'm saying that even skeptical historians would agree that that disciples really believed it when they said they saw something, when they said they saw the risen Jesus.
And fact number 4, the disciples were transformed from doubters to bold proclaimers of his death and resurrection.
And fact 5, James, the brother of Jesus, who was at first a skeptic, was later converted when he also saw what he believed to be the resurrected Jesus. So I don't know how many of you in this room have brothers. So just imagine if your brother came up to you one day and told you that he was God. I mean, that's probably how James felt, when Jesus told him that. And yet, almost all historians agree that James experienced something that made him change his mind about his brother.
And finally, fact number 6, Paul, formerly known as Saul, was likewise converted by what he believed to be an appearance of the resurrected Jesus. Before Saul was an apostle, he was one of the fiercest opponents of Christianity. He routinely rounded up and killed Christians for preaching Jesus' resurrection. But again, almost all scholars agree that Paul saw something that turned his life around 180 degrees.
Okay, so these are the 6 historical facts. 6 facts that Christians and non-Christian historians widely agree on. And of course, you'll probably notice that none of these facts are supernatural on their own. And I mean, these facts taken by themselves are not enough to establish that anything miraculous happened, let alone that Jesus rose from the dead. But now that we have these facts established, what Gary Habermas and Mike Lacona then did, and what we're now going to do, is to ask this question: what is the best explanation that makes sense of all these facts? So think of it as building a puzzle. We have some puzzle pieces before us. Not all of them, but the crucial pieces at least. So what is the way to fit the puzzle pieces in a way that would give us the most reasonable picture? So now we're at the 4th step, coming up with the theories to make sense of the facts. So for now, we're just going to set aside all the miraculous explanations. Let's first try to see if we can make sense of things without resorting to supernatural explanations. So first, here are the top naturalistic theories that people have suggested.
All right, so for theory number 1, that's the grave robbery. This theory is an accusation from the earliest critics of Christianity. If the facts tell us that we have a corpse and that 3 days later it went missing, someone must have taken it, right? What if the disciples robbed the grave? What if the 12 disciples conspired together, stole the body, then fabricated the greatest lie ever told. In response, I want to draw our attention to fact number 3. The disciples of Jesus did more than just proclaim a controversial message. Every one of them died horrible deaths, insisting on the claim that Jesus resurrected. Dr. Sean McDowell wrote about the fate of the apostles in his thesis, where he detailed how each of the disciples were killed for their beliefs. For Peter, crucified upside down; James, son of Zebedee, executed by sword; James, brother of Jesus, executed by stoning; Thomas, speared to death in India; Andrew, crucified. On top of that, there is no evidence that a single one of them changed their minds or recanted. But notice something. The fact that the disciples died for it does not make it true. People die for all kinds of beliefs all the time. People will even strap bombs to themselves for what they believe. If I died telling you that Jesus resurrected, that wouldn't prove anything. But see, this is not the case with the disciples. If the disciples actually stole the body, they knew they were telling a lie and then died for a lie. And nobody dies for what they know to be false. In other words, liars make poor martyrs. Let me give you an example. Chuck Colson was the special counsel to President Nixon and was implicated in the infamous Watergate scandal. After his jail time, he became a born-again Christian and led a prison-focused ministry. This is what he says. "I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible." So yeah, if America's most powerful politicians couldn't keep alive for more than 3 weeks when threatened with jail time, how likely is it that 12 disciples and many others would be willing to endure torture and death to hold on to this lie? I also want to point out that this theory does not explain facts number 5 and facts number 6, why James and Paul would become Christians, let alone become the leaders of that same movement. So for all of these reasons I mentioned, the grave robbery hypothesis this doesn't work.
Okay, so fact 3 tells us that the disciples genuinely believed that they saw Jesus. Could it be that they were so grief-stricken that they started imagining things? I mean, sometimes that happens to people who lose their loved ones. So what if the disciples only hallucinated? Now, I want to point out that even though this theory seems to make sense of facts 1, 3, and 4, this theory actually completely ignores fact 2, the empty tomb. See, if the disciples only imagined Jesus coming back to life, all it would really take is for one guy to go to the tomb and check. Nope, Jesus still looks very dead to me. End of Christianity. But all jokes aside, even without the empty tomb, this theory has some other flaws when we consider it from a medical standpoint. Because think about it, what is a hallucination? Well, hallucination is by definition an individual subjective experience. People don't hallucinate about the same thing at the same time. And this is just the same with dreams, right? If I wake up to a good dream, I can't just invite Sean and you guys into my dream, even if I try to. So this is what one clinical psychologist says. I've surveyed the professional literature written by psychologists, psychiatrists, and other relevant healthcare professionals during the past 2 decades and have yet to find a single documented case of a group hallucination. Now, the earliest Christian creeds tell us that not only did the 12 disciples see the risen Jesus, more than 500 of his other followers reported the same thing. So if we say that 500 people hallucinated the same thing at the same time, that's just another miracle we have to explain. And remember this as well. If we go along with this theory, history tells us that it's these delusional people who founded the greatest religious movement in history. So this is what a Jewish historian said. If the defeated and depressed group of disciples overnight can change into a victorious movement of faith, then this would be a much greater miracle than the resurrection itself. So given these reasons, the hallucination hypothesis also doesn't seem to work.
Okay, so let's say the disciples didn't steal the body or hallucinate. What if they actually saw Jesus physically? What if Jesus only played dead until after he was in the tomb and crawled out afterwards? This is also known as the swoon theory, which says that Jesus only fainted but didn't really die on the cross. Now, to illustrate the implications of this theory, I want to do a short exercise with you. So let's get some blood flowing. So wherever you are right now streaming this, I want to invite you to hold up your arms in the shape of a T, basically like that. So to make things more challenging, you can try holding onto 2 books on each side. So you just keep this position, and then I'll let you know when to put your hands down. So now I'm going to read to you a medical description of crucifixion. It may surprise some of you that most people die from crucifixion not because of the nails, but because of suffocation. As you hang on the cross with no support for your feet, your body and arms are stretched out, and your lungs start to be filled with fluid until you can no longer breathe. And that's assuming the blood lost from being flogged and nailed on a cross does not kill you first. So how likely is it that Jesus could have survived this torture, and then in the state that he was in, he would roll away the stone, fight off a band of professionally trained Roman soldiers, then go show his disciples that he had resurrected? Okay, you can put your hands down now. Yeah, thank you. We actually don't have to guess the answer to this question, actually, because the Journal of American Medical Association actually did a medical report on this. This is what they concluded. Clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted and supports the traditional view. Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. And besides, this again fails to explain the conversions of Paul and James, not to mention the hundreds of millions of followers that come after. You can't start a religion with a guy who is half dead and hail him as divine. This is why the swoon theory also fails.
And of course, there are many, many more fringe theories that people have come up with. Some say Jesus was an alien from outer space. Jesus had a twin nobody knew about. One scholar even thinks that Jesus was buried in a shallow grave and he got eaten by wild dogs. But at the end of the day, no matter how hard people have tried, there still hasn't been a naturalistic explanation that accounts for all the facts in a satisfactory way. Most of the theories either lack explanatory scope or power to make sense of the facts in a coherent way. But don't just take our word for it. I would encourage all of you to try this yourself. Try to come up with your own theory for what happened. And you can have some fun with this. Just make sure that whatever you come up with can make sense of the 6 historical facts.
Yeah, so when all is said and done, what are we left with? What we're left with is the resurrection hypothesis, which is the unique solution that Christians have offered from the very start. The resurrection hypothesis satisfies all of the facts in the most coherent way. It says that Jesus died and rose again after 3 days, leaving the tomb empty. He then appeared to his 12 disciples and 500 others. After seeing a literal appearance of the risen Jesus, the disciples went from cowards to bold men, proclaiming to everyone what they saw, even willing to be killed and tortured for it. Jesus also appeared to James, his brother, and Saul, an enemy of Christians, causing them to change their minds about him. Everyone who saw Jesus went on to kickstart the largest religious movement in history. That's how Christianity began and has become the biggest world religion today. The resurrection hypothesis satisfies every single one of the historical facts without a stretch. This is a picture that makes the most sense of all the puzzle pieces we have in front of us.
So again, now that we've looked at all the facts and explored the theories, it seems like the weight of the evidence suggests that Jesus of Nazareth did die and rise again. But before we wrap up our investigation tonight, we just want to ask one more question. Why should I care that somebody died 2,000 years ago? What does that back then have to do with me now? But you see, the significance of the resurrection is not in the what or the how. The whole point is the who. Because the resurrection isn't being claimed for some random individual. It's being claimed for Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah that the scriptures and prophets have foretold for centuries. The man who healed the sick, raised the dead, fed the hungry, the man whose morals and values represent the pinnacle of Western civilization. But most importantly, he is the man who called himself the I Am, Son of the living God. So you see, if the resurrection is true, it tells us more than the fact that miracles are possible and that the universe is an extraordinary place. The resurrection validates Jesus' claim to be God. He's not just a common carpenter, not just some exemplary moral teacher. Jesus is the bread of life, the fountain of living water, the way, the truth, and the life. And he has come from the other side with a message for all of us.
Yeah, so the message is that the God who created the heavens and the earth is also the one who created you and me for the purpose of having a relationship with him. But man in his rebellion rejected this offer of love and chose the things of the world instead. Our sin against God is choosing to sever that relationship, and being cut off from him, we're left as restless wanderers trying to be fulfilled by something else. We tried to find satisfaction in the things of the world, money, love, success, but it was all in vain because we were cut off from God and chose to live a life where we were in charge. And this sin, our offense against God, can never be made up by just being a good person. There's nothing that we can do to fix our broken relationship with him. But thankfully, that's not where the story ends. Because God loves us so much, he sent his own son Jesus down to earth in the form of man, and to ultimately pay for the price of our sin by being nailed to a cross. His promise is that everyone who believes in Jesus Christ as their Savior will be forgiven. And for those who do, a new life with Jesus starts now and lasts forever.
So today actually marks the midpoint of Passion Week, which commemorates the last week of Jesus' life on earth, his death on the cross and on Good Friday, leading up to resurrection on Easter Sunday. So this Easter, I just want to urge all of you joining us today who don't consider yourselves Christian. Look into the evidence yourself. We've just laid before you the case for Easter. Ask questions and wrestle with all these facts. See for yourself whether the testimony of Christians across 2 millennia really does stand on solid ground. Because if this is true, if Jesus actually rose from the dead, this is huge. This is like finding a cure for COVID-19, but 1,000,000 times more. If Jesus resurrected, it spells the end not just for coronavirus, cancer, AIDS, but for death itself. We can live eternally just as Jesus lived. And I just want to add that 8 years ago, when I followed the evidence where it led as a skeptic, it completely changed my life. And I can confidently say that my decision to follow Jesus was the single best decision I've ever made in my life. There's just nothing I've ever received or can receive that can even come close to the life with Jesus I'm living now. And you know what? Tonight, that same offer is available to all of you. You too can begin on this spiritual journey of a lifetime. Of course, our hope and prayer is that you would find what we found. That at the end of the road, that you'd find not just the God who raised Jesus from the dead, but the God who is waiting for you to come home.
Yeah, and that's all we have for tonight. Thanks everyone for joining us. We're now going to hand things back to Nathan.
Yeah, thank you, Sean and Godwin. Really appreciated all the time that you guys took to thoughtfully think about all of this evidence. And if you guys have any further questions, feel free to contact Sean and Godwin offline. They'll go ahead and follow up with you. And again, if this talk piqued your interest at all, we'll be back here next week where we talk about moral objectivity. But before we dismiss, I just wanted to share a few can't miss celebrations that Klesis has coming up. These are some of the highlights of the year for Klesis, and there's been a small army of people putting work on videos, art, and content for some of our first ever online celebrations. So if you come to anything all year, this is it. So for Good Friday, which is the day of Jesus' crucifixion, we have our Good Friday service at 2, 4, 6, and 8 p.m., 8 and 10 p.m. And for our Easter service, it's going to be at 1:30 with our first ever virtual choir. And then if you can't make that one, we have services at 9 and 11 a.m. as well. And then on top of that, we have also a Passion Experience, which is an on-demand, interactive, and immersive experience designed to help you meditate on the events of Jesus' final week. And all of these things, the Good Friday service link, the Easter Sunday service link, as well as the Passion Experience, can be found on the Klesis website, Instagram, or Facebook. And the website URL is berkeley.klesis.org. And each of these things, today we talked a little bit about the evidence for believing why the resurrection happened, but these services and experiences are going to contain a lot more about the content of the Christian faith and the significance of the life of Jesus. So really hope you guys can make it to one or many of those things. Thanks, guys, and have a great night.